Are we closer than ever to nuclear conflict? Moscow warns the threat is real, but is the Kremlin stoking fear, or is nuclear war an actual possibility? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. Only twice in the planet's history have nuclear weapons been used. In 1945, the United States detonated 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, killing about 140,000 people and leveling around 70% of both cities. Now, the thought of that happening again is hard to bear, but since Russia launched its assault on Ukraine, real fears of a nuclear conflict have risen again.
The prospect of nuclear conflict, once unthinkable, is now back within the realm of possibility.
Well, recently, Russia has ramped up its rhetoric. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov delivered a stark warning to the West, telling them the threat of a nuclear attack should not be ignored.
Really, the risks are really considerable, and I wouldn't want to elevate those risks artificially. Many would like that. The danger is serious, real, and we must not underestimate it.
Meanwhile, Kiev says those threats are meant to scare allies from supporting Ukraine. Washington is watching closely. State Department spokesperson Ned Price called Russia's comments irresponsible and says the U.S. is keeping a close eye on the Kremlin.
We have seen in recent weeks a pattern of bellicose statements, and whether you call them statements, whether you call them bluster, whether you call them propaganda, this has become a pattern. These certainly are provocative statements. We think they are deeply irresponsible. We deem them to be a continuation of the Russian government's very clear attempts to distract from its failure in Ukraine. It comes to potential nuclear escalation. Of course, we are paying very close attention to Russia's activities, to what it's doing, to what it's not doing.
But while most of the world is following events in Ukraine, thousands of kilometers away, North Korea has promised to step up its nuclear weapons program. During this lavish parade marking the founding of North Korea's armed forces, Kim Jong-un showcased his vast array of missiles. And in a passionate speech to his people, he vowed to speed up the nation's nuclear program and threatened to use them if provoked.
The fundamental mission of our nuclear forces is to deter a war, but our nukes can never be confined to this single mission of deterring war, even at a time when a situation we do not desire of at all is created on this land. If any forces try to violate the fundamental interests of our state, our nuclear forces will have to decisively accomplish its unexpected second mission. The nuclear forces of our republic should be fully prepared to fulfill their responsible mission and put their unique deterrent in motion at any time.
Now, out of the almost 200 countries in the world, only 9 have nuclear weapons. They are China, France, India, Israel, North Korea, Pakistan, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. According to the Arms Control Association, those countries have at least 13,000 nuclear warheads between them, though some argue that number is actually much higher. Those missiles could cause unfathomable damage, and if enough were used, humanity could cease to exist. So, with arsenals growing ever larger around the world, let's explore the frightening potential for actual nuclear conflict. Joining me now from Cambridge is Paul Ingram. He's a senior research associate at Cambridge University's Center for the Study of Existential Risk. Dan Smith joins us from Stockholm. He is the director of SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And in Denver, we have Owen Toon, a professor of atmospheric and oceanic sciences at the University of Colorado, Boulder. So first, let's establish where everyone stands on just the fact that we're actually talking about this. Let me begin in Denver. Brian, are we being alarmist, or is the world in real danger?
I think the world is in real danger, and it's been in real danger for quite a while. But we seem to have reached a critical stage here where Russia is using the threat of nuclear war to try to keep the other countries from helping Ukraine. So this is very dangerous, not because Russia actually plans to do anything, but because there might be an accident or some misunderstanding at this point that could accidentally lead to a nuclear conflict. Russia is not so stupid as to actually launch a nuclear war. They would be left as a smoldering ruin.
Okay, so describe an accident or a misunderstanding that could actually lead to something that could threaten the planet.
Well, there have been a number of cases where this kind of thing has happened. Usually an early warning detection system from one country to the other has thought it's seen the launch of missiles. For example, there was a sounding rocket launch from Sweden some time ago, which was misinterpreted as a beginning launch of a nuclear attack. And the Russians were very concerned about this. And fortunately, they realized it wasn't an attack. And there have been several cases like that. The worst situation was in the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the United States didn't realize that there were submarines with nuclear torpedoes, and they didn't realize that there were 50 tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba. And had they tried to invade Cuba, there would have been a nuclear bloodbath there on the attacking troops, which probably would have provoked a world war. So we're in a kind of situation like that now with the Ukraine. I mean, you don't want to have any sorts of nuclear weapons used here. And although there are 13,000 strategic nuclear weapons in the world, Russia also has about 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons, probably which they intend to use in Europe if there's ever a conflict. And some of those could be just as big as strategic weapons. I mean, a lot of nuclear weapons are made to destroy cities. It only take one weapon to destroy a city.
Dan Smith, are you equally concerned? Are we in a dangerous place?
Yes, we are. But I think that one of the things that comes out of what's just been said is that those of us who study these kinds of issues over a number of years would say we have been in a dangerous place for a long time. And one of the dangers has been that we broadly concerned opinion worldwide, have been a bit complacent about nuclear weapons over the last 30 years, partly because there have been a lot of successes in bringing down the number of nuclear weapons. There were some 70,000 in the mid-1980s. There's some just under 12 to 13,000 right now. And I think that for years it was felt that nuclear weapons were kind of essentially yesterday's problem, apart from cases like Iran, over which there was a lot of concern, especially in the US, elsewhere as well, and North Korea, to some degree also India and Pakistan. I think what's happened now is that opinion is waking up to how dangerous the situation is. I mean, the truth is that while nuclear weapons exist, there is a possibility that they will be used. While nuclear weapons exist, there is a possibility that there will be an accident, a purely technological one, as has been discussed, and the kind that we came so close to destruction in 1983 at a time of heightened East-West tension in the Cold War. And it took a Soviet colonel disbelieving the information on his computer screen to keep us all safe.
Okay.
And we don't want to be in that position. But yes, we are in a dangerous place. We have been for a while. I think it has got worse recently because of the events in Ukraine. But I think that perhaps the bright spot is we are waking up to it.
Let me ask Paul then. I mean, why isn't the doctrine of mutual destruction actually enough to ensure that there won't be a nuclear war?
So the problem with deterrence is that it has nuclear risk baked into it. State leaders have to be prepared to use nuclear weapons. That is, they have to be ready to use the threat that they're making. Otherwise, there's no point in having these nuclear weapons. We already have a situation in Ukraine where we have the forces of a nuclear weapon state fighting an active war, which is very different to some of the examples that we've already heard about, which makes it more dangerous. we've got nuclear weapon states supplying the other side, and we have statements coming out of London and elsewhere that seem to ignore the fact that the rattling of the cage of Russia makes this situation more and more risky. Today, we have the situation where the British Foreign Secretary is saying that it's fine for the Ukrainians to attack Russia on Russian territory using British equipment, and the Russians responding by saying that British targets within Ukraine are fair game. This is nuclear weapon state against nuclear weapon state. And there doesn't seem to be a sense of restraint here, which recognizes the dangers that we're in. But I hope Brian will go into greater detail later in describing the consequences of an exchange of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I want to get to those consequences in just a second. But Paul, let me quickly ask you, because we've been talking mostly about Russia because of the conflict in Ukraine. But is that where you actually see the biggest threat when it comes to the deployment of nuclear weapons, especially given the language we've heard out of North Korea most recently?
So I'm always skeptical about comparing one nuclear threat to another. They all have their significant concerns. Certainly the rhetoric coming out of North Korea and the display that we saw earlier this week demonstrates a very worrying sign that the North Koreans are willing not only to describe these as weapons of deterrence, but also more than that, as weapons of demonstrating that North Korea has status in the international arena. Now, the North Koreans are not the only ones. And then, of course, we've got India and Pakistan, which currently today does not seem to be the biggest threat in terms of media attention. But it only takes a small spark to light the fire. And the modelling that Brian and his colleagues have done have been focused on India and Pakistan for a very good reason, not least that is where a lot of the analysts think that nuclear war is most likely.
Very interesting. Dan, I saw you had a comment. Do go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick one, because you were asking, why isn't mutual assured destruction enough? Why can't they just stand still and stop there? And I think there's two good questions in the nuclear age, neither of which really has an answer that's satisfactory or comfortable. And the first one is, as a state leader, as Paul was saying, what do you do if deterrence fails? What do you do then? I mean, in the nightmare scenario, everybody's blown up and you can forget about it. But actually, you're deep in your command bunker. Nuclear war has started. What do you do now? Well, the answer is you try to win. And so militaries on both sides have tried to come up with doctrines and forces to go with those doctrines that explain how you could win. And then the other good question is, well, how on earth can you make sense out of the concept of nuclear victory? What is a victory worth after a nuclear war has started? And the answer is, it's really not worth anything. And that takes you back to mutual assured destruction. So what we've seen in nuclear strategic doctrine over the last, I would say, at least 50 years, is the debate just circles round and round around these questions. And you go sometimes towards mutual assured destruction with its very nice acronym of MAD, and sometimes you come towards nuclear use theory with its equally nice acronym of NUTS.
Okay, that's well put. What are the real consequences of winning? Professor Toon, let me ask you, because Paul as well talked about the longer-term consequences of such a conflict, and you have described in detail the threat of a nuclear winter if any nuclear weapons are actually detonated. First of all, tell us exactly what that is, what's its likelihood, and why didn't we see that nuclear winter, in the wake of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for example?
Well, it takes more than one nuclear weapon to cause a nuclear winter. So that's why it didn't happen with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or this 600 nuclear weapons test in the atmosphere before 1963. So these weapons are made to destroy cities. So if one modest-sized nuclear weapon, say 100 kilotons, which is the smallest weapon on an American submarine, detonates in a city, it can kill 100,000 to 1,000,000 people, depending on the density of the city. For example, if you attack Beijing or a large city in India or Pakistan with very high populations, you could kill 1,000,000 people with one weapon. That's a small weapon. But it's unlikely that only one weapon would ever get used. We've examined a war between India and Pakistan. We don't know very much about the size of the weapons in India and Pakistan, but we estimate just the direct casualties from the bombs exploding could kill 50 to 120 million Indians and Pakistanis just from the blast from the weapons. But that's not what causes a nuclear weapon. When a nuclear weapon blows up in a city, it not only knocks down buildings, it also starts fires. A nuclear weapon is like a piece of the sun. It's like bringing a piece of the sun down to the earth. It creates a bright flash of light. And of course, it knocks over buildings, which opens gas mains and things. So these fires in Hiroshima, for example, burned about 13 square kilometers. And that was from a very small weapon that now could be coming from an artillery gun.
Right. Can I ask this as well? I mean, given the pressure, let's put it that way, given the pressure our environment is under just due to global warming, I mean, how much could the detonation of any large nuclear weapon actually further destabilize our entire atmosphere? Is that a negligible concern, or could there be serious destruction because of how much our atmosphere has been compromised already?
Well, I don't think it matters that we've had greenhouse warming because what happens here is called an anti-greenhouse effect. So you burn a city, for example, Hiroshima, and that created a huge cloud that reached the stratosphere and was full of smoke. People took pictures of it. And so if you have a war with lots of weapons, the United States, for example, has 2,000 nuclear weapons aimed at Russia or Russia and China, or who knows exactly where they're aimed. You start burning all those cities and putting all this smoke into the upper atmosphere. And we've actually seen what happens from big forest fires when you put smoke in the upper atmosphere. The smoke goes high in the atmosphere where it never rains. So it can stay there for a year or more. And it blocks the sunlight because the smoke contains black carbon, which absorbs sunlight very well, and reduces the amount of sunlight reaching the surface. So we think if there were a war between the United States, NATO, and Russia, that the amount of sunlight reaching the surface would drop by 70%. And when you lose sunlight at the surface, it's going to cool off. We think you get ice age conditions from that. We also think that the amount of material that an India-Pakistan war would lead to ice age conditions. So you'd lose rainfall. It would be very cold at the surface. At mid-latitudes in places like the Ukraine or Iowa, which are major grain-growing regions, it wouldn't get above freezing for as long as 2 years. Agricultural people have looked at our results lately, and they predict a war between India and Pakistan could kill 1 to 3 billion people on the planet from starvation. And a war with the United States, Russia, NATO could kill 6 billion people on the planet from starvation.
Those are just apocalyptic scenarios being described. We can only hope that we never come anywhere near that, but still, there are these threats. Paul, I'll come back to you. There's the threat of accidents, misunderstanding, and there's also the threats just being outright made to be interpreted whether or not they'll equate to deliberate action. So what are some of the scenarios, do you think, that could unfold to make Russia's threat in particular a reality at this point?
Well, it's always difficult to predict when the decisions are being taken by literally 1 or 2 people, and they have total control. So we can attempt to say that it is irrational for Putin to be thinking about the deliberate use of nuclear weapons. And it would be, and I tend to be in the camp that believes that Putin would not contemplate the deliberate use. But these are probabilities based on assessments and analysis, which could be flawed. I can see the potential for a demonstration shot by the Russians if in 3 or 4 months' time it becomes clear that they truly believe they are in a proxy war that threatens their very existence. And if that happens, then NATO has a choice about whether it uses a nuclear weapon in response or whether it chooses a more effective response that does not involve nuclear weapons, but perhaps, let's say, joining Ukraine in the war. That's still a very risky situation. I think I can come up with a variety of different scenarios. Most of them are unlikely, but given what Brian has just said and the consequences of a nuclear exchange, unlikely is not good enough. We need to be really clear that we are not ready to be using nuclear weapons or seriously threatening them.
It is tragic, though, that we were on such a path toward, global nuclear disarmament. There were moves called Global Zero that didn't seem far off, just a decade ago. Dan Smith, is global nuclear disarmament even possible anymore?
It's possible, right? There's no technical reason that makes it, that rules it out. If states were able to agree on a framework of really peaceful relations and cooperation to take on the overriding problems of climate change, the rest of the environmental crisis, which is the collapse of biodiversity, the loss of biomass, the pollution problems that we're facing, all of these need cooperation and good relations to resolve, let alone then thinking about the risk of the next pandemic and so on. So were it to be decided that we really have no choice but to go forward together against these challenges, then I think that would be creating the atmosphere in which it would be possible to think about nuclear disarmament globally. But as soon as you're thinking about insecurity, you're thinking about the other side might try to take advantage. And especially if you have a notion of security, which is very close to power, that I can only feel safe if I am stronger, then I think it becomes hard to see how politically and in terms of political psychology, it would be possible to achieve complete global nuclear disarmament. And then I think realistically, the goal that one is thinking about is nonetheless further reductions. Bring them down still further. 12 to 13,000 nuclear warheads worldwide, even though only about a third of them are deployed operationally, is still way more than is needed simply to blow up the world once or twice. So bring the numbers down to hundreds at least, maybe even just scores. There would still be then the basis for a minimal nuclear deterrence. You would be removing most of the risk of people being tempted by the idea of war fighting, but you wouldn't be asking for the world's political leaders suddenly to become saints.
Professor, that's interesting. Interesting how you put it. Professor Toon, just quickly, is there anything we can do as a global society to stop this? If these weapons, as all have agreed, are effectively in the hands of, just a few men who seem to be pretty disconnected from the concerns of their societies?
Well, in the 1980s, there were 70,000 nuclear weapons that had been created. This doesn't make any sense. There's only 200 cities in Russia with more than 100,000 people. 200 cities. The United States has 2,000 weapons there. That means they can attack every city in Russia with 10 nuclear weapons. You only need one of them to destroy most of those cities. And what happened in the 1980s is that the science community and the other people who study these problems told Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev that they're dangerous, and they responded. Gorbachev had some very eloquent discussions of this, saying, "Oh, it was just immoral to threaten civilization this way, and we should remove these weapons." And Reagan understood the same thing. So I think we've lost communication with our leaders. They, haven't thought about this in a long time, and they need to be informed about it. So I'm very encouraged to think that this Ukraine situation will spark dialogue, and people will do something. However, I think we also have to realize that Russia is moving toward becoming a failed state. It's like North Korea. You have a dictatorship there maintaining itself, starving its citizens, investing in war instead of investing in its population. And Russia is moving in the same direction. Its economy is all based on oil. And oil and petroleum and natural gas are going to be eliminated because of their climate effects, which is going to put incredible pressure on the Russian economy and the Russian people. I know lots of Russians. They're very moral, perfectly nice people, great sense of humor. We don't need to invest in the militaries. We should be investing in
And yet they
solving the
do.
climate
Scary thing is,
things
though,
like
these men, when they feel like they're going down, they can potentially decide to take everybody with them. Paul Ingram, I can give you 20 seconds for your quick final thoughts.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just to say that it may appear incredibly difficult to resolve this problem right now, and it is. But taking a strong message that was said earlier really well. When the sun shines, that's the opportunity that we have, and we have had in the past many opportunities. If we are going to deal with the global catastrophic risks we face effectively, we have to do so with persistence and with energy, and that's where everybody has a role to play.
Okay, Paul, I will have to give you the final word. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this fascinating discussion. Thank you all for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Our viewers, of course, as well. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.